The last session of this very interesting conference titled Oral History and Urbanity. I will introduce the first speaker, Azadeh Subut, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Manchester. And her talk is titled War, Memoryscapes, and the Grassroots Agency for Justice, Researching the Truth Memory Practices of Palestinians in Nahr al-Bared.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful for having this opportunity here today. It doesn't often happen that you come to a place to share the experience of your journey with people who have actually been part of that and have shaped that. And I'm very privileged to be here today with many of you within the audience who know how you contributed to this journey for the last 5 years. I particularly want to acknowledge two people in this room who probably would never appreciate the crucial significance of their contribution to where I'm standing today. The first one would be Rosemary Said, whose conceptualization of the idea of Palestinians in the camp living in transience, permanent, reshaped my understanding of how I could think of Palestinian camps as transitional spaces within a transitional justice framework, in a way bridging the idea of a spatial experience of injustice to the further understanding of transition and temporality. The second person is Ismail Sheikh Hassan, whose committed activism as an urbanist and researcher, and whose connections and introduction reshaped my practice and also visionary on how to work in Palestinian camps. I'm very grateful to both of you, and of course many others that, because of limited time, I can't name here. My research started with this photograph. I remember the first time I saw this image. I found myself intrigued by the concept of the wounded space. A space torn and fractured by violence and exile. A space where memories and lives have been killed. Where homes, schools, and cemeteries have been killed. Between May and October 2007, Nahr al-Bared, the second biggest Palestinian camp in Lebanon, home to 35,000 people, underwent a 104-day military conflict between the Lebanese army and the non-Palestinian militant group, which had taken refuge inside a camp. Over 5,000 buildings were destroyed. The mosques, schools, community centers, and children's playgrounds were turned into ashes. The conflict led to 400 civilian deaths and over 1,000 injuries, a large portion of which are permanently disabled. Reflecting on the intersection of herbicide, transitional justice, and the spatial experience of violence, I became interested in the relationship between the violation of bodies and the destruction of spaces. And I embarked upon a journey to find the conditions under which these same bodies and spaces might heal and once again reappear. Due to the limited time, unfortunately, I won't be able to go into the process of my theoretical framing, but I just mentioned very briefly about the word herbicide, which was a term initially used by Bosnian architects after the mass destruction of Bosnian city, which they referred to destruction of cities as a way of destructing communities. And my experience with Nahr al-Bared came to be seen through that lens of herbicide. During 2015-2016, over a 4-month ethnographic research in the camp, I engaged with urbanists, architects, youth, and community activists in documenting the ways in which destruction is experienced, conceptualized, transformed, and resisted. To do this, I incorporated a multi-method in which life stories, ethnographies, and fragmentary form of expression were collected. I collected visual archetypes, drawing collages with children, and spatial stories, photographs, documentaries. In my last week in Nahr al-Bared, I met Treza Daoud, a Palestinian woman in her 40s, who recounted the memories of her stay in the camp during the siege of Nahr al-Bared in June 2007, when she was one of the 2 women remaining in the neighborhood, resisting not to leave her home. She shared her poem, which she had written while living in the siege, hearing the bombing and shelling. I've translated the poem, which is quite long, into English, and I would like to recite a few parts of that. The roof of my house remains suspended since ages. It begins cracking until bursts with all those residing in it. We were feeling ourselves in the deserted homes, seeking our fleeing selves amid the rubble, looking for ourselves in the annihilated pathways of life. They murdered you, my camp, as they murdered shadows of the tribe, destroying all the beautiful memories of life. They killed our dead people thousands of times, erased their names from the memories encyclopedia. Here she refers to the destruction of Palestinian cemetery in the camp, dyeing the color of walls with the color of funerals. Treza's testimony is an indicator that for people of Nahr al-Bared, the camp did not just provide a shelter. It was a place where they reassembled the hundreds of families that had been dismembered and scattered in repeated cycles of forced displacement, occupation, and repression. It was a material testimony, the camp, of what was destroyed and all that remains, a few towns and villages forcefully cleansed in northern Palestine. I completed 4 drawing workshops with children in Nahr al-Bared during my stay. And what I found that children's recollections illustrate houses and buildings with images of shelling, military invasion, fragile foundations, and unstable structures. In their drawings, children have moved house and home to the front line of the conflict. Their recollections evoke concept of domicide or the murder of home. As I started looking into intellectual analysis of experience of drawing and how psychologists have engaged with children's drawings, I came to the work of a prominent psychologist called Kellogg. Throughout her work in different parts of the world, Kellogg has come to an opinion that the image of the human comes first in the prevailing sequence of child art. Contrary to Kellogg's opinion, what I found almost in the 22 drawings that I collected from Nahr al-Bared, it was the image of home that always exceeded the portrayal of human. The finding which evokes the centrality of home to the Palestinian child and the destructive impact of domicide in their memories. During my time in Nahr al-Bared, I have repeatedly visited women living in prefabricated houses made of zinc and iron. Now, after 12 years of war, still families live in places which was only supposed to accommodate them for 6 months. Visiting women who still live in these unlivable shelters, I have often been astounded at their attempts to create a sense of home even when the home does not exist. Women have strived to restore the loss of home by whatever means available to them. Their acts should be seen then far more caring for an individual family, rather as a site of collective resistance and political struggle to restore the integrity and connectedness of the community. This is one of my favorite images of the early destruction of the camp. As you see in the picture, the woman hanging the laundry on the clothesline to dry. We can tell from the image that the building which is in that can't offer much of shelter. The roof has completely collapsed. The windows are all missing. And even the upper floor has collapsed. In fact, even the spot where the woman is hanging the clothes is at the edge of destruction. But what she does is an act of resistance in the context of routinization of violence in everyday life, is a way of forging continuity and reinforcing the existence of her community in the camp. When I started doing a collaborative drawing workshop with children in the camp, my idea was to engage with children from the age of 10 to 14, because I wanted to make sure the children participating had already been born before the war. Even if they were 2, 3 years old, they could maybe provide some testimony through their drawings. However, there was this child who were accompanying his 2 older brothers, and he was only 7 years old. I didn't disagree with his presence, of course, but I wasn't going to use his image for the reason I had decided he couldn't provide testimony. He drew this image, and I looked at it. Okay, he has drawn Palestine flag. And because I had already decided I'm not going to use the image, I skipped it. It took me a year when I looked back at the drawings of children and I found myself struck. Did he really mean to draw a Palestine flag? If he had meant to, why this is vertical and not horizontal? And if he just wanted to draw a flag, what is that structure doing up there? I started to think, perhaps he drew his image of home as Palestine. A drawing that illustrates how the loss of home and the loss of homeland are intertwined for Palestinians. Coming to know his family have changed 7 houses within 12 years of displacement. I would start to think that his drawing symbolically ties the story of loss of Palestine to the loss of home in Nahr al-Bared, and his parents' ongoing struggle to find and make a home through the cycles of uprootedness and disposition might have shaped the experience of this child, even though he was not born before the war. As I was working in Lebanon and with UNRWA unit for design in Nahr al-Bared, I found about the architect Saba Inab, Palestinian architect who had come to Nahr al-Bared after the war, and I found some of her archetypes that she designed in the aftermath of the conflict, in which she has defined the idea of permanent transience and building without a land through her designs. If you look at her design work, you see a disturbing imagination of upside-down architecture. It brings you to the question, can building without a land be a form of rejection to loss? Oh, sorry. I want to take you back to the previous image. You have seen Saba's upside-down architecture. Now look at Poha's drawing. After 5 years, I still don't know what Poha meant by drawing this image. But I can know for sure he just didn't want to draw a flag. I asked an elderly Palestinian man about his final wish in life. He responded, to be buried in Palestine. I asked, why did he think the geography matters to the dead? to the dead. He said, when you're buried in a place, you're forever grounded there. Even in death, there is no relief from the plight of displacement. His words illuminate that death comes to a closure only when the body is buried in a soil it belongs to. A body buried in exile forever fails to claim to the land it has embraced, and therefore continues to remain both symbolic and concrete embodiment of displacement. I take you back to another archetype of Saba, which I found a strong correlation between this archetype and the life and death as experienced by the Palestinian people, the notion of in-betweenness, and how her archetype is an epitome of Palestinian displacement, the landlessness which is signified by the presence of the absent. In her work, I see a dramatic reflection on the space of life and death. I also see, as she asks, how life and death in a state of suspension has been created in an architectural design. This is her quote. She says, when we die, we become the dead and the land. The question remains, how do we die if we live out of place? In other words, how do we die if only we die in time? Thank you. Thank you. If you don't mind, I haven't finished yet. This is my final.
Okay, sorry.
But this is a very emotional story. I always pause. On the last day of Ramadan, I joined children in the camp to a ritual of cleaning the cemetery and washing the graves. And these graves mostly have been destroyed. There was this young boy called Hadi, who you see with a hat in the middle of the image, and he called me asking, can you take a photograph of us? And suddenly I found myself in front of few children who had posed to be photographed, and kind of their connection to the grave made me worried, might that person be their mother? So I went closer and I found the person was born in Palestine. And I asked who was the grave for, and they said their grandmother. Hadi looked at me and said, you know, my grandmother's wish was always to be buried in Palestine. And since she couldn't fulfill that wish, I have promised her that when a day comes and I return to Palestine, I will carry her with me. That experience embodies that cemeteries were the site of promise and affirmation for the younger Palestinians toward their old generations. It also recounts how to the family members and children, remembering the dead and the injustice that has happened to death continues to be part of a daily struggle. Writing Resistance on the Margins of Power 71 years on from the Nakba, these stories are trying to tell the story of a long-standing injustice. The accounts enable us to reimagine the material layers of a space that contains substances, souls, and meanings, and allow us to construct meaning inside the spatial imaginary which has been lost. In this case, Nahr al-Bared stories not only explicate destruction and herbicide as a human destruction, but also connect us to the layers of destruction, such as memory, home, spaces, and identity. But what all these grassroots memory practices have engaged in is an act of truth-telling to power and a form of resistance against forgetting. Thank you.
Thank you, Azadeh, for your presentation. Our next speaker is Diala Latif, who is a doctoral candidate at the Geography and Planning Department at the University of Toronto, and she's currently a visiting fellow at IFI. And her talk is about the evidential power of testimony, the role of Nakba, oral narratives in... That's not you?
That's not me. That's me. I was like, wow, he reinterpreted my talk. It's beautiful. I was excited.
Oral histories, practices of refuge, and the making of quarantina.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Hi, everyone. First, I'd like to say that I'm delighted to be part of this wonderful conference and wonderful project, so thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'll start with a small disclaimer. I'll be presenting part of my doctoral dissertation work, so please consider the following as preliminary findings. I'm currently a year into what is planned to be a 15-month data collection phase. I'm conducting my fieldwork primarily in Beirut, but I've also done some archival work in France and Switzerland. Okay. As most of you already know, in recent years, and particularly with the ongoing Syrian crisis, Lebanon suddenly found itself again on international news headlines. As one of the neighboring countries to Syria, Lebanon has become one of the biggest hosts to Syrian refugees fleeing the conflict. In fact, it became the host country with the highest rate of refugees per capita, where 1 in every 4 individuals is a refugee. But prior to this large influx, Lebanon as a country has had a long history of hosting refugees. My own doctoral dissertation explores more specifically the last 100 years of displacement, starting with the arrival in the post-World War I of an influx of a large Armenian population fleeing the Ottoman Empire's genocide. The larger question motivating this research is about understanding how refugee spatial practices contribute to and intervene in the making of urban life in their host cities over a century. So, taking this question as a starting point, I'll be looking more specifically at one sub-question in today's presentation. What are the spatial practices of refuge within the urban context, and how do these spaces and practices of habitation, which I call a demand for the right to the city, affect the city? From a methodological perspective, this presentation today poses a specific question. How do oral histories of the everyday life contribute to the production of a more complex understanding of subaltern perspectives within the city? To do so, I look at a specific neighborhood known as Quarantina on the most eastern end of Beirut that was one of the initial hosts to the Armenian community, and where across the years many other populations of refugees have settled. I specifically chose this neighborhood because I wanted to position the refugee question within its historical context. In many ways, the Quarantina neighborhood represents a microcosm of Lebanon and its politics and history, but also that of the larger geopolitical climate in the Middle East during the last century. From World War I to the declaration of an Israeli state or the Lebanese civil war, these refugees are the wounds of all the major conflicts in the area. And although the conflicts that have originated their displacements have been studied at length, the everyday lives of these refugees has only surfaced in the literature in the last few years. Considering a little over the first half of the timeline of my project, here is a quick overview of the population that settled in this neighborhood before the Lebanese civil war. We start with the Armenians that arrive after World War I, followed by Kurds, and the Palestinians as of 1948, in addition to a population from southern Lebanon, who are in fact displaced for practically the same reasons, the Israeli invasion, and come in search of labor opportunities. Finally, with the rise of the Ba'ath Party in the mid-50s in Syria, this leads to a huge economic shift in Syria, leading a large population of Syrian migrant laborers to join, as well in search for more lucrative work opportunities. These newcomers settle amongst a pre-existing native community known as Arab al-Maslakh, Arabic for Arabs of the slaughterhouse. initially cattle merchants or a nomadic tribe from the Iraqi desert, which sedentarized in this neighborhood in the late Ottoman era, and a white and blue-collar Christian population that lives a little bit further west. It is worth noting that 1976, the year where this current timeline ends, is a very important year for this neighborhood and the Lebanese war more generally. In fact, on the 19th of January 1976, this day marks the first and one of the biggest massacres of the Lebanese civil war. The operation was led by the right-wing Christian Phalangist militia and targeted the slum dwellers of Karantina, causing one of the largest internal displacements of the war. The history of this place is one can say, riddled with forced displacement. First, a host to thousands of refugees. Later on, it produces its own. In the 90s, a minority of the native population returns to the neighborhood and, in line with their history, currently host a community of Syrian refugees. But these incidents are beyond the scope of our interest today. In this presentation, I will focus on one particular decade, from the early 60s to the early 70s. The data I will present has been collected through about 100 in-depth interviews, which are to some extent complemented with some archival research and secondary sources. Now, going back to the multiple communities of Karantina, their arrival into this relatively small neighborhood is no coincidence. In fact, the neighborhood owes most of its development to three central institutions. I'll walk you through these on this aerial shot of the neighborhood from 1963. First, the port. The port of Beirut, whose development starts in the mid-19th century. The presence of the port creates job opportunities and other needs. In fact, a quarantine area is set up. A quarantine area is set up nearby, which later transforms into a hospital facility known as the Karantina Hospital, which is a state-owned hospital, and gives its name to the neighborhood. With the presence of cattle merchants and herders, a slaughterhouse is also inaugurated in the neighborhood, giving its name to the local Arab tribe, thus Arab al-Maslakh. The combination of a slaughterhouse, a port, and the Beirut River, which you see at the very right of this image, attracts byproduct industries such as multiple tanneries, bone processing plants, cattle markets, etc. And as a small industrial area starts to form near the river, the need for cheap labor attracts lower income populations in search for employment. It is also attractive due to its proximity to downtown Beirut and its ease of access through public transit. The neighborhood is known as one of the oldest slums in the city, where a mixed population of refugees, migrant laborers, and native population live in very close proximity. Very few studies of this neighborhood have been conducted, so definitive data has been very difficult to find. But two studies by different ministries within the Lebanese state estimate the population of the area to about 13,000 dwellers. Although a definitive, reliable subdivision within the subgroups has been almost impossible to find. The numbers are particularly unreliable because they focus largely on the slum within this neighborhood, an informal settlement built with wooden structure covered in tin, known as tanake, and somewhat ignore the presence of concrete building, largely occupied by the native and middle-class foreign population. These are quite visible on the aerial shot, if you look closely, but here is one of the rare images from 1970 that I was able to find. It is particularly rare because it displays the close proximity of the tanake structures to the more formal buildings in the background of this picture. It is in fact this relatively unique situation that got me interested in the neighborhood, a non-encampment where the refugees are relatively well integrated with a native population. Now, when interviewing the local population, or even experts and sometimes historians, the typical narrative that prevails is a sectarian one. This is unfortunately very present in the literature on Lebanon and for the local population, a particularly hard narrative to escape after the Lebanese civil war, which literally divided the neighborhood in two opposing camps. So we had the Christians on the west and the Muslims on the east. The line on this visual represents the actual demarcation line that separated the two camps during the fighting. The sectarian argument also seeps into research on the refugee populations of Lebanon, where, for instance, a dominant narrative regarding the Palestinian population is that their sect, where they are majority Sunni, was actually a determining factor in their reception by the Lebanese government, and the complete opposite regarding the Armenian population is largely accepted due to the fact that they were in majority Christian. The first contribution I would like to make through this work is stepping away from the sectarian angle, be it for historical purposes or even the analysis of the refugee scenario in this case study. Although sect did play a major role during the war and Lebanese history more generally, I would like to propose a different analytical framework to help us get past the standard binary, if you will. My proposal is in fact inspired by a statement of one of my participants, a displaced individual from the Arab al-Maslakh, who was the first to explicitly separate the life experiences of the Tanake people, those who lived in shacks, from those who lived in concrete buildings. So he says, the bigger price for the displacement was paid by the Tanake people because they were more vulnerable. He's of course speaking of the displacement of the Lebanese war. In this specific example, this person, despite being a local of the neighborhood or a citizen in a legal sense, found more in common with the refugees than the other Arabs who lived in what he called cushy apartments. This is also confirmed by interviews done among the cushy apartment occupants who bundle everyone else without any specific distinction. So they will say in their statements, there was an us versus a jumble of foreigners who lived in shacks. So instead of the Christian versus Muslim angle, I suggest a reading through a Tanake versus concrete angle. Spatially, it will look something like this. So we would move from a Christian versus Muslim into something more complex, where the red here is the Tanake and the blue are the people who lived in concrete. In other words, I am proposing analysis through the lens of class. An approach, I believe, will bring an interesting new perspective to the case study specifically, but also more broadly to studies on displacement and the history of Beirut. In the multiple interviews I have done with the local population, a sense of subaltern unity was very present amongst the Tanake dwellers. The life worlds of individuals were mostly structured around their blocks and all spoke of shared rituals, practices, and even spaces. And in this specific time and place, in the 60s in Karantina, Beirut, this particular unity transcended the refugee versus citizen distinction, even extending to migrant laborers. In fact, one participant used the expression وحدة الحال, which I translated as common destiny, to describe how he remembered the community in the settlement. I will briefly go over 3 examples that demonstrate this last point, collected from the oral histories of this community. The community evidently shared the space in the neighborhood. Their kids went to the same schools, they bathed on the same municipal bath, they got their vaccines in the same local clinics. But on a more intimate level, among the many things this community shared were first and foremost rituals. So in case of a death, for instance, and regardless of the deceased sect, people remembered walking in processions together, and all shop owners closing their businesses for the occasion. So for instance, the Palestinians would say our Armenian, Syrian, or Kurdish neighbors would join us while their businesses would close their storefronts in respect for our deceased. They also shared local figures. In the Middle East, we have a culture of the abadai, I'm sure you all know this, which is essentially the tough guy in the neighborhood. There was specifically a man named Garo, who was used to be known as the Robin Hood of Karantina. Garo was so famous, a movie was made about his life in 1964. But above all, he was remembered by all equally. People claimed to have hid him from the cops or have offered him food and shelter, and Garo was Armenian, but all the community loved and respected him. Finally, these shared practices only create stronger bonds of solidarity that tie this community more strongly through a shared desire of staying. Without going into too much detail, Karantina was victim to multiple fires in the 60s. Many were said to have been instigated by the landowners because they wanted the settlers to leave the land. And they wanted to evict these people from their land. So in the face of adversity, the local population showed their solidarity with one another. So I'm showing you here an image that was taken after one of the 1963 fires, and we see how people have gathered. So those affected by the fire would be hosted by families who weren't. These were your neighbors, distant family members, etc. But no one was left on the streets. And a few weeks later, they would help each other out to rebuild what was lost, and neighbors pooled their belongings and donated mattresses and food to help them settle back in. I view all these spatial practices of this community as this community's claim to their right to the city. In my conversations with the community, I realized that although they were not using the exact language of the right to the city, they were using the language of segregation and discrimination. Their sense of solidarity was very much motivated by their desire to counter these measures these measures that were targeted against them, the fires being a prime example of this. I'll cite here Lefebvre himself, the philosopher who coined the right to the city term, and who explicitly makes a connection between claiming our right to the city and discrimination and segregation. He says, excluding from the urban groups, classes, individuals is also excluding them from civilization, if not society, is not from society. The right to the city legitimizes the refusal to allow others to remove us from the urban reality through a discriminatory, segregational organization. And the desire to remain, rebuild, and live in harmony that this community displayed is but another claim to their right to the city, to their collective right to be included in society. But whose right to the city is being claimed here? Within this specific case study, the distinction between legal or illegal, or refugee and citizen, is blurred, without undermining the real implications of illegality of refugees, particularly the Kurdish within my case study, most of whom remain to this day paperless and completely invisible to the system. This case study argues for a more complex distinction between these two groups, one that is mediated by a subaltern unity, where for practical purposes, a realignment of needs transcends the legal distinction and certainly the sectarian angle that dominates the literature. I also believe that the case study can contribute to the conversation on refugees more broadly by shifting the focus from an isolated encampment community of refugees onto an urban space of cohabitation, which underlines the everyday struggles of refugees, ones that are strikingly shared by the local dispossessed populations. In spaces such as Karantina, which I call spaces of overlap, since they group refugees with the local, we begin to see how the struggle and oppression is in fact shared by legal and illegal groups. And although the illegality of some makes them more vulnerable, their close proximity to the locals attracts some properties by transitivity. This is a good moment to reflect further on oral histories and research. In the specific case study of Karantina, a neighborhood mostly known for the Civil War massacre, oral histories were indispensable. The existing literature and most common public discourse focuses on a simplified narrative that erases the presence of certain communities while confusing some with others. These oral histories were indispensable because they allowed me to move away from the binary dominant narrative and emphasize the importance of the everyday life in understanding socio-political histories of the city. I think the real lesson to be taken away from this case study is the choice of a common destiny, or the subaltern unity, a narrative we can only derive from these oral histories, because when two vulnerable groups choose to stick together, a stronger whole is produced. Going back to the example of spatial practices I presented, these are specifically the type of solidarity action that makes this group more cohesive and more inventive in their appropriation of the meaning of citizenship. It is specifically when a Christian walks behind a Muslim burial procession, or when an Armenian fills the role of a Lebanese abadai to become a well-respected local figure, or when a Kurdish family takes in a family of Southerners who were turned homeless after a fire. It is specifically these actions that showcase the mutual exchange that happened between these two groups, an exchange of culture, tradition, and material wealth. This unity between two marginalized groups, a dispossessed population of citizens and refugees, created room for a new invented form of citizenship, one that is closely tied to notions of class solidarity. This new subaltern unity transcends the typical binaries and is enacted through a shared claim to their right to the city. I think a focus on a subaltern history, such as the Karantina case study, can help us better understand the long-term effects of settling refugees amongst local marginalized communities, but also allows us to reclaim a space for these communities in our urban histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Diala. Our third speaker is Suzanne Assam, who is a postdoctoral research officer in Middle East Studies at the University of Oxford. And her talk is titled No Minds, No Borders, Towards an Oral History of South Lebanese Border Communities.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ismail, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for having me here and for being here today to this special event. I really enjoyed it. So when looking at the history of the Lebanese or Palestinian border communities, from the pre-Nakba generation, their interconnectedness and strong economic social links are very obvious. Yet current studies often separate the two. By emphasizing the intertwined history of southern Lebanon and northern Palestine, this paper argues for the importance of collecting and linking the oral history of southern Lebanese to Palestine and Palestinians. In this presentation, I will first briefly outline the history of this border area and how it was interlinked. Then I will reflect on key phases of displacement of my maternal grandparents from the border village of Blida to underline people's experience of Israeli aggression. And following that, I will reflect on the research questions I'm currently interested in pursuing on the lives and the multiple phases of displacement of the South Lebanese border community, border population. I'll conclude with some reflections on how we can link Palestinian and Lebanese experiences of the Nakba and why such a comparison would benefit our understanding of the formation of this region. So, the series of boundary agreements between the British and French ahead and following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, beginning with the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, decisively remade the region. Vital economic, social, and kinship links between what became North Palestine and South Lebanon were significantly transformed or largely destroyed. This configuration disconnected Jabal Amil from its role linking Damascus and inner Syria to its coastal cities and ports of northern Palestine and beyond, which was crucial for its economic sustenance. After the establishment of Grand Liban, the markets of Bint Jbeil, Marj Ayoun, Nabatiya disintegrated, end quote, leading to, I'm quoting Abi Saab, leading to migration to Beirut. Up until the late 1930s, Haifa was the main urban center for the Amilis that was mostly known and visited by them, and not Beirut. As historian Malik Abi Saab describes, quote, the Palestinian lira circulated among Amili hands more regularly than the Lebanese one did, end quote. While the mandate system significantly reconfigured the economic space of the region, travel and work across the imperial frontiers was still possible for a time. Through the Good Neighborly Relations or Bon Voisinage Agreement from 1926, which the French had negotiated with the British, the inter-border crossings between Palestine and Lebanon were allowed during the mandate period. By studying pilgrimages that took place across the newly drawn borders of the mandate period, Tuful Abu Hadib shows that there used to be strong links within different sects and active pilgrimage networks between South Lebanon and North Palestine, which continued into the mandate period. Quote, towns such as Nabatiya, Bint Jbeil, Khiem, Marj Ayoun, and Hasbaya not only served as stops for caravans coming from Syria and on their way to northern Palestine, but were also markets for goods in their own right. Merchants from all over Palestine would come to Bint Jbeil's Thursday market, one of the most prominent markets of the region until today. The agreement helped people escape the perils of this boundary, if only temporarily. The shrine of Nabi Yusha was of particularly importance of the Shiite community. Pilgrims from Shia villages in proximity of the Hula Lake used to walk annually to the shrine of Nabi Yusha during the month of Sha'ban. Initially, according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Nabi Yusha was part of Lebanon, but according to the Paulet-Newcomb Agreement of 1923, it was reassigned to British Palestine. Nabi Yusha is one of what became known as 7 predominantly Shia villages that were reassigned from French Lebanon to British Palestine. In 1948, these villages were occupied by the Haganah and consequently depopulated and destroyed. The visits to the shrines and all the border crossovers into modern Palestine ceased after the war in 1948 and the subsequent General Armistice Agreement of 49. Nabi Yusha, as well as other villages on the fringes of both the French and British mandates, often changed hands between the two or subject to simultaneous and overlapping British and French rule into the 1940s. I'm not sure how visible it is, but you can kind of see the boundary marcation and how the villages are inside of it in this one. And in this one, in this one they're inside Lebanon, and then the other one outside. It's not so visible. Okay, so over the years, it was often unclear whether they were part of the British or French mandate. I always said that. So similar to today's depopulated Palestinian villages in this area, many of today's Lebanese border villages were occupied by Israel in 1948. The Haganah attempted to take them over several times during the 1948 war and occupied them for a year. This was part of the battle over Malkiye in late May and early June of 1948, where Kawukji's Jaish al-Inqad fought a hard battle with the forces of the Haganah. Despite Kawukji's initial success recapturing the villages early June that were occupied by the Haganah mid-May 1948, the Haganah's Operation Hiram, launched by Ben Gurion, finally captured this area and villages comprising Karas, Malkiya, and Blida again in October 1948. Operation Hiram saw some of the worst massacres of Palestinians by Israeli forces during the war, including at Dawaime, thank you. I was wondering how to pronounce that. Safsaf, Saliha, Aleboun, and Hula. The war seemed lost, and many villagers decided to leave to refugee camps north of the Lebanese border. Some or part of these villages, about 13, were returned to Lebanon under international pressure in 1949, after which the inhabitants could return. However, 3 of them, Malkiye, Nabi Yusha, and Kadas, all in walking distance from Blida and Hula, which are today in Lebanon, basically, and other villages' agricultural lands remained in Israel. The population of the neighboring villages did not return after this war, in which they were forced out. Yet, this politically and military history often omits the social experience of peasants and villagers that made up the vast majority of the area. We know that what became border villages used to be intimately linked, yet in today's historiography, they are often separated. I will now move to outline the importance of linking the oral histories of today's South Lebanese villages to Palestine. While there's not much written about the life in these border villages, at the time, it's clear that the establishment of Israel in 1948 disrupted social, economic, as well as trade relationships that existed with Palestine. To the people of South Lebanon, writes Ahmad Baidoun, both Christian and Muslim, the cities of Haifa and Akka were better known than was Beirut. The economic activity of today's Lebanese villages turned north after the separation, especially due to the destroyed labor and marketing opportunities in Palestine. While most cross-border activities seem to have ceased in 1948, it's not clearly known when exactly everyday links were severed completely. In a paper I actually wrote for Rosemary Sayer's class about 10 years ago, I conducted initial research interviewing my maternal grandparents, who are both originally from the village of Blida, where I was also born. So you can see the village here, and it was one of the villages that basically was on the British, part of the British Mandate of Palestine and the French, and kept changing back and forth.
What is it called?
Blida today, but here it's written Belide. So, okay. Initially, I conducted some initial research interviewing my maternal grandparents, who are both originally from this village, where I was also born. In this work, I traced the displacement in the months and years following the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. As I explained, in 1948, the Haganah occupied Palestinian as well as about 13 Lebanese villages in southeast Lebanon. During this year, as my grandfather recalled from family stories, quote, Israel went in and occupied the front villages. My grandmother carried me and hid me under the olive tree. I was about 4 years old. His family was displaced, and they had to escape to Ati, a village further north. In contrast, he described the time prior to 48 as he knew from his family, quote, there were no mines, there was no borders, there were no border crossings. Wire, they put wire. Yes, there was none, and they just put it the other day. When they occupied in 48, there was no wire, only stones. They came and had cars, tanks. We did not see that before. As a young boy in the late 50s, my grandfather moved to Al-Basta in Beirut, which he describes as escape from the poverty of the village. As for my grandmother, it's not clear when her family left to Beirut, but she was born and raised there until her marriage in 1963 as a teenager. Her first experience in Blida was only after the outbreak of the civil war in 1975. At this point, she and my grandfather owned an apartment at a grocery store in Maslach, which we just learned about from Diala, a neighborhood largely populated by poor Shia and Palestinians and others alike. When right-wing Christian forces began to overrun this and other suburbs of East Beirut. The outbreak of the civil war in 1975 and the onset of the Israeli occupation of the South in 1978 formed a turning point in the lives of my grandparents and their generation. From that point, insecurity governed their lives as they began moving back and forth between Beirut and the village, depending on the intensity of the war in each location. In 1975, my grandparents and their 6 children moved back to Blida, where they lived in tiny 2 to 3 room houses with each of their parents at different times. In my grandmother's words, quote, yes, we lost it all, our house, our wealth, everything was gone. Do you think I was able to get back what I had, Habibti? We escaped Beirut carrying nothing in our hands. During this, end quote, during this time, as Baidoun writes about Bint Jbeil, the closest town to Blida, the usual population almost doubled from 12,000 to 24,000 within 1 month. Citing Baidoun, quoting Baidoun, giving rise to nightmarish scenes of up to 50 persons crammed into 2-room houses, sleeping on rooftops, in gardens, on balconies, wherever there was space, end quote. The Israeli invasion of 1978 caused yet another displacement and forced my grandparents to move briefly back to Beirut. Since their previous apartment in Maslach was destroyed, they rented a new place shared with another family in Uza'i. After Israel's 1982 invasion and siege of Beirut, many families from the south that were living in Beirut at the time returned to their village, since all was occupied anyway and the brunt of Israeli force was focused on the capital. That year, due to the dire economic situation, my grandfather was compelled to leave his family behind to work as a construction worker in Saudi Arabia. My grandmother agreed to move back to Blida after her cousin had offered her to stay in his empty house. Without her husband around, however, she was still obliged to take her children and sleep at her parents' house every night due to the insecurities that living under Israeli occupation entailed. After 4 years of absence, my grandfather returned to the village to live with his family in 1986, when he had earned enough to build a house and establish a small grocery store in the village. Life under occupation remained difficult. In order to avoid having their young boys conscripted into the Israeli-sponsored South Lebanese army, my grandparents arranged to send them to Beirut, one after another, starting at the age of 11, with no possibility of return. Liberation in May 2000 reunited the family and many other families which shared a similar destiny. For much of the next 6 years, a fleeting period of stability and happiness reigned, in stark contrast to what preceded it. This was crushed through yet another major Israeli invasion of Lebanon that again separated the family. My grandmother, her children, and their children, who escaped to Hama during the July 2006 war, leaving behind my grandfather, who wouldn't leave his own father, sister, and village behind. As my grandmother recalled, quote, We stayed a month, but how did we stay? Always crying, unsure what will happen to our homes, crying because I did not know what would expect me upon my return. What if we don't have a house anymore? Yes, because we already had gone through this once in our life. And now our house, what would happen to our lives if it would burn down again? If it burned down again. This description of their last displacement during the 2006 war underlines how their past displacement and insecurity shaped my grandmother's life and outlook. As my grandfather exclaimed during the interview, quote, "I have land, and the land is what makes me a citizen. What is the one who does not have land? For what? What good is he?" End quote. Clearly, the Zionist dispossession of the Palestinians shaped the everyday conditions and outlook of the Lebanese, and not always constructively. The rich literature on the Palestinian oral history documents the displacement of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, how they lived and moved around, and the conditions of their displacement. Julie Petit writes about the refugees in 1948, quote, "spending nights in the wilderness," end quote, moving between Akbara in Palestine and Bint Jbeil and Irmesh in Lebanon. Also, she documents the conditions of Palestinians living in Maslach and Karantina in Beirut. As we learned through the story of my grandparents, inhabitants of the South Lebanese border villages shared a similar destiny and were living in the same locations in similar conditions at numerous times. The history of Palestinians from the north and Lebanese from the south is firmly interlinked. Yet in the literature, this common history is often overlooked or separated. The story of my grandparents is only the tip of the iceberg. This summer, I will be carrying out research in the south towards constructing a united history of Lebanese and Palestinians vis-à-vis the ongoing Nakba, which investigates the changes in the everyday life of southern Lebanese border communities and documents the displacement following the Zionist colonization of Palestine. What is it like to live at the edge of an expanding settler colony? How did southern Lebanese experience the Nakba and its aftermath? How were the villages connected prior to the Nakba? When exactly did the cross-border movements of people and goods completely cease to exist? Linking Lebanese and Palestinian oral history is crucial to creating a more honest history of the Eastern Arab world that breaks through the colonial borders. I'm especially interested in finding out how the phases of displacement affected people's lives and how it shaped who they are today, their relationship to land, and their political formation. Furthermore, this research will investigate the links and networks as well as direct opposition and suspicion that the Palestinian national movement encountered in South Lebanon. What were the dynamics of support and opposition for the Fidayeen? What were the factors that contributed to the impatience with the Fidayeen presence by the end of the 70s, considering Israel's policy in South Lebanon contributed greatly to separating and opposing Christian and Muslim villages and populations against each other? My research seeks to interrogate how Israeli policy contributed to the growing hostile reaction to the Palestinian presence. Given the dearth of state of written sources on the common history and social life of northern Palestine and southern Lebanon, oral history is an important method for retrieving the complex history of interconnections. Not to be misunderstood, I'm by no means trying to make equivalent the Lebanese and Palestinian experiences of Zionist colonialism, whose primary eliminatory actions were directed at the latter. In line with the aims of the Palestinian Oral History Archive, my goal is to give voice to a history that has largely been neglected, thereby challenging dominant colonialist and Zionist discourses and narratives. Today, much of the literature of the Lebanese-Palestinian border is written within a clearly Zionist framework and agenda. The application of the concept of settler colonialism allows us to move away from such culturalist and essentialist perceptions that underline the exceptionalism of the Arab-Israeli conflict as sectarian conflict between Jews and Muslims, which potentially justify Israeli practices as precondition for the creation of Israel. It furthermore draws important links to settler colonial formations elsewhere. which helps to draw broader parallels. Scholars working on Palestine have recently applied the analytical framework of settler colonialism with rich results. However, scholars of Lebanon have yet to significantly incorporate how Zionism has shaped and Lebanese state and society. It's crucial to view the events that happened in South Lebanon in the past and present in the context of Israeli settler colonialism, as it would allow for to continue to connect the situation in Palestine to the experience of the southern Lebanese. Such a history then would contribute to a common history of both Palestine and Lebanon that looks beyond the imposed colonial boundaries and is told through the eyes of the people that were directly affected by them. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. We have one last talk by Khulud Al-Ajarma, who could not make it to the conference, and we will listen to her talk, which is recorded. Khulud is a doctoral researcher in the fields of anthropology, theology, and religious studies at the University of Groningen, and her talk is titled The Evidential Power of Personal Testimony, the Role of Nakba Oral Narratives in Asserting Palestinian Right to Their Land, illustrated by a specific challenge mounted to the JNF's appropriation of land of Ajur village.
Marhaba. Hello. My name is Khulud Al-Ajarma. I am a Palestinian anthropologist, filmmaker, and refugee rights advocate. It is unfortunate that I'm unable to be with you in person today, yet I'm grateful for this opportunity and for being able to share some of my work in connection with the Palestinian Oral History Archive. My involvement with oral history started at the age of 14 when I began collecting narratives of Nakba survivors in Aida refugee camp where I was born. In those narratives, the villages of origin were the center of personal memory accounts for the camp's residents. Here, allow me to introduce you to Fatima from the village of Ajur, my grandmother, and a resident of Aida camp.
بقالي صبراتهم يوم اروح القطها النصية الكد واروح فيها يقعدوا علي بهالمواس يشبعوا يمتلت نفسه الواحد ما ياكل 5 حبات 6 حبات يشبع الكواس. اليوم لو ركب واحد بس تطير وتيجي قدامي.
Until 1948, Ajur was home to some 4,330 Palestinians living on 58,000 dunams of land. Ajur was attacked first in July 1948 and completely occupied on the 23rd of October of the same year. The village of Ajur today, together with neighboring Deir al-Dubban and Kudna, is an allegedly national Israeli park named Britannia Park, or the British Park, established by the Jewish National Fund, known as the JNF, a colonial organization that I will discuss in this presentation. But first, it is important to say that this presentation takes the narratives of Fatima and other survivors of the Nakba from the village of Ajur as a central point of departure to argue that oral history and personal testimonies of the Nakba survivors can be powerful tools in holding colonial organizations such as the JNF accountable for their actions against Palestinian refugees, using as example a recent case against the JNF in the UK. The Jewish National Fund, JNF, known in Israel as Keren Kiryat L'Israel, KKL, was created at the Fifth Zionist Congress in Switzerland in 1901 to acquire land and property rights in Palestine. The JNF, in the words of its founders, was set up to redeem the land of Palestine as the possession of the Jewish people. Under JNF regulations, Palestinians and other non-Jews in historic Palestine were not allowed to buy the land acquired by the JNF, rent it, work, or live on it. At the time, the JNF was the most prominent Zionist symbol. Notwithstanding such ambitions, the JNF in its early years was not successful in its mission to redeem the land of Palestine. By May 1948, the JNF owned 3.56% of the land of historic Palestine. After 1948, the newly established state instituted a military government and declared Palestinian villages as closed military zones to prevent displaced Palestinians from returning. The Israeli army and the JNF became the two Zionist institutions key to ensuring that the Palestinian refugees were unable to return to their lands. In fact, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was one of the early goals of the JNF. Yusuf White, the director of the Land and Afforestation Department of the JNF, wrote in his diary on December 20, 1940, and I quote, "It must be clear that there is no room in the country for both Arab and Jewish peoples. There is no way but to transfer the Palestinian Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. For this goal, funds will be found." End of quote. Indeed, funds were found in the name and shape of the JNF, which acted ever since as a colonial organization. Since 1948, the JNF has planted trees and built parks and recreational facilities, mainly on the ruins of Palestinian destroyed and depopulated villages, to hide the forced displacement of Palestinians from their lands. As historian Ilan Pape writes, in these forests, Nakba denial is so pervasive and has been achieved so effectively that they have become a main area of the struggle for Palestinian refugees wishing to commemorate the villages that lie beneath them. End of quote. Palestinians do not only wish to commemorate these villages, but to return to them, a return that has been denied by the Zionist organizations. The JNF claims to be an environmental organization while actively participates in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Today, the JNF continues to remove Palestinians from their land across Palestine, especially in the Naqab. Examples of the parks established over Palestinian villages that were depopulated in 1948 include the so-called South Africa Forest, created atop the ruins of Lubia village, Canada Park, created on the ruins of Amwas, Yalo, and Beit Nuba, USA Independence Forest on Dereban, Beit Atab, Deir el-Hawa, and Jirash villages. JNF claims on its website that the British Park or Britannia Park, established on the lands of Ajur and the other villages, was established with the help of its friends in the UK, and that's why the case was made to deregister it as a charity from the Charity Commission in the UK. In fact, JNF has charity status in more than 50 countries, including the UK, the United States, and Canada. This status gives the JNF privileges, including raising funds in these countries and transferring it directly to the KKL in Israel. The oral narratives and testimonies of the original residents of the village of Ajur were essential in challenging the charitable status of the JNF in the UK, which I will discuss now. First, however, it's important to mention that the JNF role in Israel's colonial regime over the Palestinian people has not gone unchallenged. In the past 10 years, the status of the JNF as a charity organization has been questioned in several countries, including Canada, Scotland, the UK, and Australia. What I will discuss here is a challenge mounted in 2018 as a helpful illustration of a possible model of framing oral narrative effectively in what was an attempt to deregister the JNF from the UK's Charity Commission. In 2018, a collective of 3 activists, one of whom is myself, the other 2 British, Irish, UK residents, made an application to the Charity Commission to deregister the Jewish National Fund UK as a charity. Our case framed in the historical and contemporary activities of the JNF within international and UK law and standards. The JNF UK, for example, in this promotional video, claims to be 100% Israel, and the implications of this claim were scrutinized given the recent legislative positions adopted by Israel, such as the nation-state law. This framework acted to showcase the first-hand oral testimony of the people from the village of Ajur, the Nakba survivors from the village of Ajur, and their disposition as Palestinian landowners of the lands that are now claimed to be the British Park and seeking the right of return to those lands. We all recognize that the achievement of the deregistration of the JNF UK would not provide an instant or total solution to the refugee problem, but as many cases in the British judicial system have revealed, example those connected with justice for Irish people, the process can be long and incremental. So we accepted this as one step in that process. I now focus on the core narrative, the Palestinian story. In the application I wrote to the Charity Commission, I documented the narratives of Palestinian Nakba survivors from the village of Ajur, including my grandmother, Fatima, and how they were driven from the village. So not only the life pre-1948, but the displacement of the refugees in 1948, the role of the JNF in that displacement, and the denial of the right of return. I also documented their current everyday lives in Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank. The impact of the actions of the JNF and other Zionist organizations on these families was more than a material loss, though that alone is tremendous because these families owned thousands of acres of land now planted over by the JNF, enjoyed by thousands of visitors, while we, the rightful owners, cannot even visit without a permit from the Israeli authorities. Along with the story of my grandmother and the testimonies of the other Nakba survivors from the village, I also collected title deeds that these families continued to possess, proving ownership of the lands claimed by the JNF. These documents including, for example, this one, which is land ownership agreement from 2 siblings to my grandfather. The contract states the price of land and the type of land suitable for agriculture and is dated 11 November 1942. The second paper here is from the year 1929, documents purchasing a piece of land planted with olive trees by my grandfather. A third document is a registration paper from 2nd of May 1938, and the fourth is a revenue tax receipt over my grandfather's land. The receipt is dated 14/12/1932. The document proves that my grandfather used to pay tax over the land he owned in the village of Ajur. All what these documents prove, together with the narratives of the Nakba survivors, is their lawful rights to the lands of Ajur, a land that was never sold nor abandoned, in contrast to the false Zionist propaganda that Palestinians sold their lands to the Zionists before 1948 and voluntarily left their places of origin in the years of the Nakba. In the application to the Charity Commission, I called on the Charity Commission to revoke the charitable status of the Jewish National Fund, which has been so instrumental in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The reply of the Charity Commission, however, was disappointing, disregarding the narrative of the people of Ajur and claiming that we do not have a legal standing to challenge the status of the JNF. Even if the Charity Commission has initially rejected the case, success is incremental, and an idea or approach is often in circulation long before its moment of triumph occurs. So we believe that this has been a step on the direction of achieving some rights for the Palestinian refugees. The request for the Charity Commission was the first step towards a legal case in which the argument was made regarding the right of the people of the village of Ajur to holding the JNF accountable for its actions. An appeal was made to the First Tier Tribunal Charity in Manchester regarding whether I or the two other appellants, as UK taxpayers, should have standing, the legal right to appeal against the decision. In the tribunal, the lawyer speaking on behalf of the Charity Commission conceded that the oral histories might well be true, based on the narrative presented in the application to the Charity Commission, and admitted that the Nakba survivors and their descendants might have legal rights that have been breached by the actions of the JNF. However, what he said is that, in his words, if we were granted standing or a legal right to appeal, that will get the Charity Commission and the British government probably in what he called issues of political controversy, which he means by is the rights of Palestinian refugees and the relationships between the British government and the colonial state of Israel. As much as I would have wished for justice in the British legal system, the court case was not successful. What was successful, however, was the support and awareness the accompanying campaign had from the British public, tens of whom were present at the court session in Manchester to show support, and hundreds who expressed support in the public events that took place at the time. The narratives of Palestinian Nakba survivors, I believe, can continue to place the core issues of ethnic cleansing and the right of return center stage, inspiring activists to hold the JNF and other Zionist organizations accountable for their actions. The campaign to hold the JNF accountable is not over, and the voices of displaced Palestinian refugees and their refugee descendants will play a key role in this process. Edward Said once argued that to write more truthfully about what happened in 1948 is a moral act of redemption and a struggle for justice and for a better world. And the narratives of the Nakba survivors from the village of Ajur will continue to be a marker of the injustice committed against the people of the village. Oral history is a major tool in reconstructing the history of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced Palestinians as seen from the perspective of primary subjects. In Canada, the US, Scotland, England, and other places, activists are working to bring the JNF to justice. The case of the JNF UK and the legal challenge highlighted in this presentation is merely a sample of what is happening in relation to the JNF and how Palestinian oral history is used to challenge the Zionist institutions. Oral history can be instrumental in the defense of Palestinian national, moral, and human rights. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all of you for these wonderful talks and presentation. We open the floor now for questions from the audience. Yeah, one talk here. Can we have light, please?
Hello. My question is for Dr. Azadi and Diala, please. Camps do have borders, whether physical or non-touchable borders. Can you briefly describe the relation or the language you found on site between the settlers and the nearby Lebanese community? I mean by that, to describe the borders you tackled during the study. And if you, another question, if you seek to, in your study, to examine any solution to integrate between the two communities. Thank you.
We have a question there.
The question is for Suzanne. I don't know how much of a question, but is there has been written material on the border things by Dr. Jaber, and I think Baidoun. And Julie Petit has done some work on oral history in the region. Has there been any others? I'm really, at one time I visited around 10 years ago, and through the village of Barashid, Barashid, correct. I interviewed one older woman who saw the Palestinians come down, and her family was working in Haifa. This was a great interest for me to see the kind of links. That's all what I have about these borders. And it's so important for us to build all the territories in our oral history, all the connections of the people who have come, and I mean, it was so friendly, the kind of relations that people had. If you know of any, I would appreciate.
Okay, maybe we can answer the first round of questions.
Thank you for your question. I would respond in regard to the camp of Nahr al-Bared, which is not exactly the same with other camps. Before the war, Nahr al-Bared was a thriving community, and it was the economic hub of the region of Akkar. So many Lebanese used to come there for their everyday, shopping purposes, and the Lebanese community living in because it's a rural area, they were very much integrated socially and economically, even though they had their own political standing of being a Palestinian camp. However, after the war, and since up to this day, the militarization of the camp has continued. The siege of Nahr al-Bared has almost destroyed that previous social and economic integrity with the Lebanese host community. So now you have a situation that it didn't exist pre-war, and it has, instead of helping to rehabilitate and reconstruct the social fabric which was lost due to war, it has reinforced the segregation and reinforced the social disintegration.
I have a slightly similar answer, I guess. It's an interesting question, actually. Quite difficult to give you a straightforward answer. Karantina has a complex history with borders as well. So if you know at all where the area is or the neighborhood is, so actually the delineation of it is the highway, and the highway was kind of a planned artery that was put there to kind of segregate this city or this part of the city from the rest of Beirut, because it was like this eastern entrance of the city, and it was ugly because it was like all these Tanakh structures that were superimposed. And so what they did is they just put the highway in, and then they built a wall and kind of just decided to forget about it. So the first border is this one. So the community, was very aware of that border, and a lot of people will tell me stories about how they remember the days where they could just cross to Mar Mikhail, or what we now call Mar Mikhail, and they could just walk, and then people woke up one day, I mean not exactly, but kind of, and the highway was there. So that's the first border, and that kind of, I think, diminished the value of the borders inside, at least in the initial storytellings of the pre-war era. But I think what the war did is that it then created these new borders that are now hard to kind of ignore, if you will. I don't know if I'm properly answering your question, but yeah, so kind of similarly, I think to Nahr al-Bared, like the war kind of turned these people a little bit against each other, and now that boundary is far more visible. I think in the pre-war era, the middle class and the upper class people, and like some of the big merchants from the Arab al-Maslach particularly, were really, really rich. Like they were upper class they owned land, exactly, but they also, they had a very good business going for them. They were the only slaughterhouse in town. So they perceived maybe the space slightly differently, but to everybody else, there was like no real distinction. But after the war, like to this day, you go and like there's a Christian, end on one side and the Muslim on the other side. It's kind of visible, yeah.
Yes, just very briefly. I mean, you tell me. I guess you know probably a lot more than I do because I'm just starting this research now, and yeah. I'll keep you informed. I mean, beyond the sources I've used in this paper, I've not investigated much. So there's Munzer Jaber also wrote. Yeah, he wrote. Yeah.
I have his book.
Yeah.
And I know of Baidu.
Yeah. Yeah. Who else did I use?
We need all of this story.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think. So, I mean, for this paper, I used a few things. Like there's Tuful Abu Hadib who wrote a paper, but there's little pieces I find here and there, but I haven't like found something really extensive. Yeah.
This old woman 10 years ago, she must have gone.
Yeah.
And if we get older people, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, that's what I'm planning to do now. So we'll see.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my next step to.
You can have the interview. So.
Thank you. That'd be great.
Another round of questions? Okay.
I actually have methodology questions. In the drawing, one to Azadeh, in most of the drawings you've showed us of the kids, it's actually like a collage of sort, right? So I'm just wondering if maybe the medium, the fact that you cut and you have square pieces of paper affects how kids draw in terms of then choosing to do houses instead of people. And especially with the flag now, when you saw, like, I was going to suggest there is a reason why the flag of Palestine is vertical, and actually it comes right away from the presentation of Khulud with the map. And it's quite common that you see the map on the, like the flag on the map. So just for you to consider if you haven't noticed it. And I have a question to Diala. So again, on borders, I'm just wondering, you said borders, I'm thinking, what is the relationship really with Burj Hamoud? When like a lot of the population there is Armenian, Burj Hamoud is just across the road, and then you have a very similar situation to Karantina in Nab'a, which is like an extension of Burj Hamoud. I just maybe situated a little bit more for us, because we see Burj Hamoud and Nab'a now living a very similar dynamic to what happened there. So.
You ready for my question?
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So the question, it's kind of a comment for Suzanne, who knows, my father's from Sha'ra, which is close to Blida, it's in South Lebanon, and was actually working in Palestine and right around 1948, and came over from Palestine with the refugees. And you're probably going to be making the economic connections between South Lebanon and northern Palestine and Haifa in particular, which I think drove my father to go and work in Palestine at the time. But I was wondering if you're going to also look into kind of whether socially they were more accepted in Palestine than the Southerners, and particularly the Shias, were more welcomed in Palestine than they were in Beirut. In Beirut, as a marginalized community at the time, couldn't find, a lot of Southerners couldn't find work and were in some of the slums that we had been talking about around Beirut and other marginalized communities. But I think like within the oral, history perspective, asking different questions around what was the connection, specifically their ability to integrate into the communities, I think would be an important question. And lastly, I just would ask you to come and visit my father and interview him. He's 90 this year.
Should I start? Or did you already answer?
Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. If I understood your question, you were asking how the collage procedure happened. I basically gave them a white, paper, as you can see here, and I had colored papers and, color pencils provided. So that was all the intervention I really had. And my question was to have an image which showed their life prior to the war and the life post-war. Poha's image doesn't have that prior. It was just one image, which, I mean, I skipped in the beginning, as I mentioned. So that was how I did it. Like, if I show you the previous, like this one, this was again, like was, you know, he didn't use the color papers. It was just a drawing. But this one, I mean, she was 14-year-old, so she was quite older. She made it in a more creative way. I don't know if I responded properly. Okay.
Yes?
So it's a good question. And actually, initially, when I first started my proposal and was very, very ambitious about wanting to do everything together, I was going to do Karantina Bish Hamoud and Nab'a, because, in fact, you know, but then, you know, the reality and everything else happened. But yeah, I mean, there is a very present connection, but also there is a very absent one. And it's a very interesting connection, and it depends on who you talk to. The presence of the highway again and the river actually creates a far bigger separation and border, even in the imaginaries of some, that you would expect. So I would say the Armenian community had a very strong tie with Bish Hamoud. And some people who had close Armenian friends or whatever, they had a close connection to that place. It comes up a lot during the Civil War and the Karantina massacre in particular, because all of them, or most of who are able to escape, they escape through that route, and so they escape from Bish Hamoud to Nab'a. And I mean, for the longest time, this was all part of the same kind of misery belt, if you will, between connecting Nab'a and Tel Zatar, and then going all the way into the Kwene. So that there is a very visible connection. A lot of the population of Karantina also has connections to Nab'a in other ways, particularly the Palestinian community. So there are these smaller groups of Palestinians who are outside these camps but have connections. So the connection is there. It's somewhat visible but not as evident as you would think, because of, I think, the physicality of that separation that kept them kind of separate. Does that answer your question? We can have a longer discussion.
To Rayan, yes, it's a very interesting question. You're asking basically if the people in the south worked in Palestine because they were racially better accepted there. It's again something I will have to look into. But since you have the case with your father, and I feel like you're thinking that it might be the case that your dad worked in Palestine rather than Beirut because of that? Or there's just something you... Okay, because so far as the sources I found, I mean, I really have literally just starting this research. I just have to underline this. But, I think, it's more that it was just closer. That's all I can find. But I think this would be a really good question to investigate. So, yeah. And just because I remembered one more thing about the sources. What was her name? May, to your question, I just remembered where you can find some information is the village books that have been written. That also exist in Palestine. Like Rochelle Davis just wrote a really good book about village histories. So I think in those books, in my own village, I found some, documentation and history, but it's all something that really needs to be pulled out. Also, But
my comment is that it's an area that needs to be covered because for oral history, because really the flow into Lebanon was very intense, and definitely Julie Petit has written about, and from what I have read a lot about the kind of suffering people got through, but we need to know where they came, how it comes, and if we could before they die.
That's my plan, so I'll keep you posted. Sure.
We can take one last question, or
if there are any.
If there are any.
Hannah?
Hannah? No? Okay, thank you for a very interesting panel. There is the closing remarks. So are you going to come down or? I think we leave now.
It's so cool. You're doing this research. So